and welcome to the Gen Z Faith Summit. I'm Matt. I'm here with Allison today from Axis, and we're talking to Andy Crouch, and we're thrilled to have him. He is an expert at making connections between culture, creativity, and the Christian faith. His recent book, The Tech-Wise Family, has really offered some insights on the way that families can approach technology and the culture of technology within the culture of the family and within the faith. So we're really excited to have him. He's also proud to say a friend of Praxis, which is a friend of Axis, which is confusing, I know. But he's the, let me get this right, fellow for culture.
Partner for theology and culture.
There we go. That's great. Thanks for helping me. Andy, we're thrilled to have you. Thanks for being here.
I'm so excited to get to talk.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And just to start it off, kind of our broad general question, this is the Gen Z Faith Summit, but how do we build the role, or what is the role of faith in parenting this next generation specifically?
Wow, that's a great big opening question. In one sense, it's no different than it's ever been. That is, I think what faith is a commitment to a story you believe to be the truest story about the world, the deepest truth we know about the world. And your faith, I think everybody has a faith, by the way, whether they say they're a believer or not. There's something you believe is the ultimate truth about the world. And if you're a Christian, you believe that the Christian story is the truest story. I guess the difference maybe between this moment in history and some other moments in the past is that there was a season, generations or maybe centuries long season in the Western world where the Christian story was kind of taken for granted as true. And most people, however actively believed it, whether they believed it actively or not, they kind of assented to it. Or even if they disbelieved in it, it was the Christian story they disbelieved in. But today, all bets are off. Everything's on the table. People believe all kinds of different things. Some people don't even disbelieve in Christianity because they've never heard it. And so raising kids in this moment is about making sure that you don't assume that the culture around you is going to teach them the Christian story. And realizing that it really has to start in the home. And for me, the charter text for us in this moment is the same as the charter text from the Jewish people from day one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is God alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then it says, teach these commandments to your children. Talk about them when you get up in the morning, when you lie down, when you go out, when you come back in. And it puts the home at the center of actually forming people as believers in this very radical alternative story. And that has to happen today. It used to be that families could trust that kids would just kind of pick it up in the culture, or they'd pick it up at church. And church is not nearly enough to disciple your kids anymore. Like youth group will never do it. It has to be when you get up, when you go to bed, when you walk around, when you're sitting at dinner table, when you're riding in the minivan. You need to be talking about it. Maybe in this moment between all the moments in our parents' and grandparents' eras.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in your other book, you talk a lot about creating culture, the culture making book. And I like to think there's going to be some crossover here between the technology conversation and that culture book. So let's walk into that right now if we can. Is there an attitude sort of or an approach that families can start to take as they're looking at interacting with technology, which is an everyday? It's an everyday common occurrence now. So is there just an attitude
yes, of course.
To take who just maybe a foreign conversation to them?
Yeah, I'd say it. And they are connected to that first book, Culture Making. What that first book was about is the idea that it's really not our job primarily to be critics of culture. It's our job to be creators of culture. And another thing that we're not made for, that's not enough for us to be human, is to be consumers of culture. We live in a consumer culture. We refer to ourselves as consumers. 100 years ago, that word didn't exist. It's amazing, to think, maybe 120 years ago, that word had never been used. And what people called themselves was citizens. But now we call ourselves consumers. And a consumer is someone who basically lets someone else create, and then we just purchase what they make, whether it's entertainment or food or clothing. And I think the fundamental attitude we need to have, including about technology, is we're here to be creators, not consumers. And that has maybe it has two implications. One is we need to be actively choosing how we relate to all the culture in our lives, the technological parts, but also just like our homes, our neighborhoods. What are we creating here, rather than just kind of what are we getting or absorbing from the environment? And I think the other second implication of that is creating is actually challenging. Creating requires effort. It requires skill. It's not easy. And the culture of technology, the basic promise of technology, is your life can be easier. This is why we buy every device we buy. And I know the feeling because we have plenty of technology in our house. I'm wearing when I bought I'm wearing these wireless earbuds, right? To listen to you guys. And when I bought them, like before they arrived, I had this vision of how much easier my life was going to be without wires, right? No more dangling cords, right? And that's why we buy everything we bring into our homes, is we think this is going to make my life easier. And in one little way it does. And it's fine in that way. But the core idea that we need to I think wake up every day thinking about is I'm not here to have an easy life. I'm here to do hard things. We're here as a family to help one another do hard things. And for that, technology will be of no use, because all technology does is make it easier. So we're going to have to realize easy is fine in its place, but that's not what our lives are for, because we're not here just to kind of have an easy consumer life. We're here to add something to the world, and that's going to require becoming different and deeper kinds of people than we have been. And technology at that point becomes as much a distraction as a kind of sorcerer's apprentice assistant in making our lives easier.
Yeah. So what are some ways parents and families just in general can kind of walk that line of making life easier, but also not distancing themselves from the hard things through technology?
Yeah, I think you have to, these devices will take over if we let them. So let me talk about something you probably don't even think of as technology, even though to our grandparents it was astonishing. And that's electric light, right? So electric light makes illumination so much easier. I have lights on in this room right now. I'll have more lights on in my house tonight. And you just flip a switch and you have light. But actually, I think there are other ways in which we're really missing out if the lights are always on. So at dinner time in our house, we turn out the electric lights and we light candles. And I will tell you, something changes in the room when it's lit by candles rather than lit by even very nice overhead lights with dimming and all that. We have nice lighting in our dining room, but we turn it off because it's too easy, and we miss out on something when we just flip the switch. And when we intentionally light those candles, which are much more trouble, honestly, like you have to replace them every week or so, you have to find the matches. It's not as bright in the room as it could be, but something happens in our relationships with each other around that dinner table when we do that at dinner time that is really special. It's the power outage effect, right? When the power goes out, as long as it's not for weeks, as long as it's like even one day, actually, those are magical times for families. And you do all kinds of things that you don't do when you have all that convenience. So for me, the basic choice that families need to make is have a rhythm where we use these things at certain times of day and in certain places in the home, but we don't use them everywhere and we don't use them all the time. So I like for people to think about, where do you spend the most important time as a family? And for us, it's kind of the first floor of our house. It's just one kind of small open first floor. We eat there. We kind of sit there after dinner. We gather there in the mornings as we're getting ready for school or whatever. And we actually want to minimize technology in that place. Now, I'm in my basement right now. I've got tons of technology here. I've got my computer. I've got a glorious screen that I'm seeing you guys on. It's like 5K. It's awesome. I have no objection to that. Over where you can't see it is actually a beautiful television that we bought once the kids were like 12 and 13 years old. When our patterns were set as a family, we're like, sure, you can have a TV, but it's in the basement. It's not in the center of the home. And then the other place I think is important is in the bedroom and at bedtime. So another thing electric lights have done is they've actually disrupted sleep tremendously in all of the modern world. And these glowing rectangles we have, these phones that we all have access to and that many kids have as well as parents, are unbelievably disruptive to sleep. And so one of our principles in our home is our phones go to bed before we do, and we wake up before they do. So we put them all to bed in the kitchen. They're hooked up to a little charger. They charge overnight.
Talk about
and they sleep there. What's that?
Just talk about caring for your technology. Are you
yeah. We always say good night, little smartphone. You know, have a good rest, have a good meal. You know, of electrons. But we leave them downstairs. This is especially important for kids. We might talk more about this, but one of the number one things that kids say is being disrupted by technology in their own lives is their sleep. And they feel like their parents don't know about that. And often the parents don't know. 82% of teenagers sleep with their phones. I just can't say how bad this is for emotional health, for physical health. And so choosing the time and the place where you use the technology, and then choosing other times and places where we set it aside, is so helpful in keeping it in its proper place rather than having it kind of take over our lives.
Absolutely. It's about creating that sacred space. So I love that
yes.
technology in this space where we're hanging out as a family and eating.
Yes, exactly.
It's not a bad thing. We have it in other places, but in this sacred space, it's not there.
Totally.
So I love that. I also loved what you were saying earlier, just about we were made to be creators. We're made in the image of a creator God. And so kind of diving a little bit deeper into the theology of technology, can you just speak a little bit about what that is and how families really embrace that idea, the theology of technology? What is that?
Wow. Yeah. Wow. What a question. It's such an important question. So I think technology is part of culture, right? And culture is what human beings make of the world. And this is our first divine mandate, is to take care of the world that God made. And I would say to sort of unfold all of its possibilities. This is why we were to become agriculturalists first, like cultivate the land. But then right in Genesis, it says the gold of that land is good, bdellium is there, onyx is there. There are these resources underground or as part of the natural world that human beings are meant to take and make something of. And technology is part of that story, and it's a really good part of that story. So our first stop, in a way, in the theology of technology is this is a very good part of the world. So we don't have to say that somehow it's bad or it's evil. We also shouldn't say it's neutral. It's not just neutral. It's actually very good in its proper place. Now, technology specifically, though, like we've always had tools, but we haven't always had devices that work by themselves and that make our lives so easy. So you think about the difference between a hammer and a nail gun, all right? So a hammer is a tool that requires a human being to use skill to hit a nail. And when you first pick up a hammer and try to use it, especially if you're really trying to use it like on a job site, you realize this actually requires a lot of skill. It looks easy. It's not that easy. Whereas a nail gun, like that's technology. It's electric powered. It almost operates on its own, requires much less skill. Like, you can nail down a whole roofing section or whatever. It's very good for doing that job faster. But here's what technology never does. It doesn't develop skill in us. It doesn't form us or develop us. So if I practice, I can become really effective with a hammer, but there's really not that. There's a little bit of practice, but not much with a nail gun. And the hammer forms and shapes me. Tools shape me, or you could call them instruments, or like things that human beings use that actually shape us and help us grow as people. Whereas devices don't shape us. So think about a musical instrument, right? If my kids learn to play the piano, we have a grand piano in our living room. It cost basically all the kids' college savings when they were small. So we just spent their college savings because any kid can go to college, but how many can grow up with a grand piano, right?
Yeah.
So clearly the right choice. So, and I also play, and I wanted my kids to hear me playing, and I wanted them to have a chance to learn. As you learn to play the piano, you become a different kind of person. You learn discipline. You learn to hear differently. You literally change. Your neuromuscular connections change and develop and grow. If you just press play, like on your Spotify channel, and listen to piano music, you don't change in the same way. So the last stop, in a way, on the theology of technology is it's really good for expressing human capacities and like extending them, but it's not good for forming them. So it's great at work. because work is where we kind of express the capacities that we've developed as human beings. It's not great in the home because the home is where you're formed as a person. Most of all, like I think about the first 2 years, the first 10 years, and the first 20 years. Each of those kind of intervals is just so consequential for who we become the rest of our lives. So much about who I am was formed by the time I was 2. And then another huge component was formed by the time I was 10. And then by the time I was 20, to an alarming degree, like any strengths I have, any weaknesses I have, it's amazing, even 30 years later, how much of that was present at 20. And that was in the formative environment of family. And if we bring all this technology in our homes that just makes life easy and doesn't develop us, then we're missing out on the formation that's supposed to happen, I think, uniquely at home. Mm-hmm. So that's maybe the last stop, it's not bad, it's not neutral, it's very good in its proper place, but the place we don't want it is the place where we're most formed as people. And yet this is the place we're just letting in it all the time and become just kind of passive consumers of so much technology when it's the last place you actually want it.
Yeah. I'm thinking of those people who are being formed more and more by the technology, particularly devices, right? Netflix is just the prominent voice in their home or something like that. Wow. Or like communication styles and habits are being formed via texting and social media. So how can families start to, if they're deep into that already, which many are, and it's so natural and easy to get there, right?
Totally.
So this is probably common. How can families start to walk themselves out of that and sort of reform all of that with different tools?
Yeah. So, well, let me tell you the approach I think backfires big time. And that's when the parents start to get really nervous about this stuff. And they're like, oh, we need some screen time limits for our kids. And it backfires more and more the older the kids are. Like you might be able to get away with that with a 4-year-old, though the tantrums you can experience when you take a screen away from a 4-year-old are like epic beyond belief, which is a sign that it is literally like biochemical neurotransmitter withdrawal. But as the kids get older, the tantrums take a different and deeper form. Instead, I would think about 2 things. First, I would think about making choices as a whole family. So people say to me, oh, kids are on their screens all the time. And I'm like, have you seen the parents? Like the parents are on their screens. When in research for this book, The Tech-Wise Family, we asked kids, teenagers, what's the number one thing you would like to change in your relationship with your parents if you could? The number one answer was, I wish my parents would spend less time on their phone or on their screen and would talk to me more. Mm-hmm. So that's the kids talking about their parents. Mm-hmm. So it's so much better to talk about how are we as a whole family going to change our practice. So we didn't say to our kids, hey, you can't take your phone to your bedroom, leave it downstairs, but we're taking our phones to our bedrooms, right? The whole family leaves them downstairs. And it's so much better to make it a family project than a parents versus kids project. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, this means we parents have to confront the way we also are quite addicted to these things, quite dependent on them. And then the other thing I'd say is make the conversation, if you sense that something needs to change, it will eventually come down to some boundaries or limits. We have to have that as human beings, I think. But don't start the conversation with limits. Start it with, what do we really want our lives to be like as a family? What have been the best times we've had? Like when have we just felt that we were at our very best as a family? And get the kids, if they're old enough, certainly if they're teenagers, totally involved in that conversation. And then ask, like, what choices would help us have those kinds of experiences more often? Mm-hmm. I think that it's hard. It's very hard to wean ourselves from these things. But if we do it all together, and if it's not parents versus kids, and if we do it based on what we really want, rather than what we're trying to stop or prevent, I think that has so much more chance of being productive. I'm not saying there's not a place for parents at some point to be the parent and be the bad guy and say, well, I can see that this is really not working well for you. And yes, you're going to have a tantrum, even if you're 17 years old, but I'm just going to put up with it because that's my job as a parent. But that should be like last resort rather than first resort, I think.
It's that idea of being able to invite the kids into this conversation and into the change that would happen within the entire home.
Exactly.
casting that vision for them versus what culture is casting. So
Yes.
I absolutely love that. And kind of going back to the creative aspect that we were made to create, what are ways that parents can really encourage and continue that invitation for their children to create, and just different ways, whether that's with music or if they're really involved with video games? How do we get our kids to stop consuming and be more on the creative side?
Yeah, so you basically want to put lots of raw materials in their way. So this was why we bought a piano. A piano doesn't play by itself, but you can learn to play it. We put a craft table in front of the big picture window in our living room when the kids were small, and had paints, and honestly, it makes a mess. I mean, creativity is messy, right? I had a parent say something very perceptive to me. She said, "Well, the reason I like to give my kids an iPad is when they hand it back and it has all their fingerprints all over it, I just wipe it once and it's clean. Like, it's oleophobic. And like, you can get it back to clean. Whereas if you give them finger paints, like, it's such a mess." But creativity is messy. Right. And so it's surrounding ourselves, all of us, not just the kids, with things that reward skill and active engagement rather than things that sort of reward passivity. So, video games are tricky. There's a lot of different things you can do that's all called video games. And some of them are super, they just reinforce all the wrong things. The big problem with video games is they make things too easy. So when you play Madden football, right, you feel like you're playing football. And it's very immersive and it's very reasonably realistic. You actually, if you went out and tried to play football, you would not be good at it at all, no matter how good you are at Madden football. And why Madden football works is it's so realistic. The only thing that's not realistic is it's way too easy, which means it's not really developing real capacity. Now, the funny thing is, it doesn't work the other way around. If you go out and play football in the backyard and play, or let alone like actually play on a team, when you go in to play the video game, you'll be really good at it quite quickly, because you are actually shaped by a holistic kind of whole body, whole mind kind of experience. So to the extent that parents, want to make room for certain kinds of video games, I'd basically ask, how much creativity is that asking of you? So to me, Minecraft is a lot more rewarding and valuable for kids, especially if you do it with them, than things that are just make it easy to like fire a gun at people. But honestly, I would recommend minimizing those things and instead put lots of things in the way, like on the way to the video game. What about some books? What about getting outside? What about getting outside without any agenda? Just find something to do out there. It's actually really interesting out there in the wider world. Like, go out. And we've gotten so protective of our kids. It's so ironic. Like part of why they're indoors all the time is the parents know where they are, but it's actually preventing them from growing and developing at all the kinds of creativity that are needed to be a healthy human being. So let go of the control a little bit, let them go outside, make some mistakes, skin their knee, rather than keeping them under control inside, but also having these thin experiences rather than really rich experiences.
Mm-hmm. Does
that make sense? Does that sound realistic to you guys?
It does. It sounds dangerous and hard. I mean,
yes,
for families everywhere. But that's kind of the point, I guess.
That's the point. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be better. Yeah, that's the way to think about it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of those families who are really ingrained, like the teenage guy or girl is sitting down on the couch for like 5 hours a night playing Call of Duty. And then the parent says, "Hey, why don't you read this book?" How can families start to make that tangible, like working, reforming experience of going outside or whatever, or playing chess or whatever it is, appealing to that kid right there? Is there a magic formula, or does it just take a lot of work?
Well, it takes a lot of work. and I think we have to understand, like, this gets very deeply wired in us. We become very dependent on these things very quickly. The good news is you can be rewired. And, we're discovering there's very encouraging information on this with respect to pornography, which is obviously a huge vector, a technological vector for something that's not good for human beings. It, on the one hand, it absolutely wires your brain to expect and need that kind of stimulus. The good news is that if you make some choices, your brain starts rewiring in more healthy ways. And so this applies much more generally to things that we become dependent on. I think the best way to do it is not evening by evening. I think it's actually to go cold turkey for a while as a whole family. So what we do every year, we take usually 2 weeks where we are totally disengaged from devices. We do take them along because like we check the weather and that kind of thing, but we have our family's lucky, I would say. We get to take 2 solid weeks of vacation, and we go away to a national park in Maine, and we're just out every day, hiking, biking. When we're home, we're cooking, we bring board games, we bring boxes of books, and the whole family, again, not just the problem child, but the whole family detoxes from our kind of connected lives. I turn off my email. For 2 weeks, I get no email. Even if I went to look for it, it's not there. It's all getting filtered right away into an archive that I never see. It's the most beautiful 2 weeks of my life.
Is that hard for you though? Is that hard for you?
Oh my gosh. The first couple, well, I didn't used to do this. I used to go and like furtively check my email on vacation while it was piling up. I mean, it piles up. And then my wife kind of called me on it. So we started about 6 years ago. I started putting up a vacation message, the auto reply message. When we leave on vacation, it says, if you send me an email for those 2 weeks, you get a bounce back that says, unfortunately, I will never read your email. And it's true. And now that I've started doing it, it's so healthy. And of course, why don't people do it? Because of it's, FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. And we talk about that like that's a kid thing. That's totally an adult thing. I'm like, well, what if an important contract comes through? Or what if someone needs to reach me? And I found out they'll email you again. If it's important, it'll wait for 2 weeks. Like, now I understand not everybody can do this, but I would suggest figure out how much, if you're in that situation you described, Matt, where you feel like we're kind of stuck and we're very dependent, or one member of our family is very dependent. Like, what's the longest possible time you could take? It's worth it to rearrange your life. Is it a weekend? Is it a long weekend? Is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? And say, hey, as a family, we're going to go, and all of us, not just you who has the problem, all of us are going to disengage. And I'll tell you, it almost doesn't matter how long you do it. Like, you could do it for a day, and this principle will hold the same as 2 weeks. The first third will be brutal. Everyone will hate each other. Everyone will be complaining. The parents will be like, now I know why I let you play Call of Duty all the time. You're such a pain in the, and it'll be brutal for the first third. And then the second third, there will this kind of, you'll start to be creative. And then the last third will be the best times you've ever had as a family. And literally that can be true if you do it just for one day. But it's better, I think, and it helps rewire you if you can do it for a week is ideal. And it's the principle of pilgrimage. Like, the idea of pilgrimage in the Christian tradition is you leave your familiar life because you know there's a better life out there, but you have to actually choose to walk away from it for a time and physically go somewhere with some other people and experience that other life. And I just can't recommend that enough. Especially if you need to break a pattern that is kind of playing out every day, every night, and you have kind of the same fights every night. Go on a pilgrimage together. Go somewhere in nature. Go somewhere just different, and don't take the devices. Anybody, and you'll suffer for the first third, and then by the end you'll think this is the best it's ever been for us, and you'll come back and you'll be able to have different kinds of conversations.
That's so sweet. It's them getting to experience what they're created for. Right? All this technology and all this, they're such a distraction. And when that's taken away, like you said, it's going to be hard at the beginning, but then yes, they're really getting to experiencing that flourishing that happens when distraction is not there.
The problem with technology is it gives us such good simulations of what we're created for without actually letting us be that. But it sure makes you feel like you feel important when you're playing Call of Duty. You feel wanted. You feel significant and accomplished at something. But it's not real. And we need to get into environments where we will be important, significant, and accomplished, and it'll be real. And that's what parents are there for their kids, is help them kind of in step by step as kids grow, have those experiences, first in very small ways when they're young, but then in more complex ways as they get older. But all of us are tempted to live simulations rather than the real thing.
Absolutely. Well, Andy, we have just so thoroughly enjoyed this interview, and you have given so much wisdom, and I think it's going to be amazing for parents to listen to this and really dive deep into this theology of technology and what does that actually mean. But just kind of wrapping up, what would a final piece of advice that you have for parents be about this topic and things that we've discussed today?
Yeah, I might borrow something from Sherry Turkle, who's a psychologist who studies kind of technology and how it shapes our society. She says every conversation needs 7 minutes to get real. And because for about 7 minutes, you can do small talk. But at about the 7-minute mark, somebody has to take a risk and say something that they don't know what the other person will say back, or disclose something, or ask a question. And I would just say, find ways to stick around for more than 7 minutes together, whether that's at the dinner table, whether it's riding in the car. The car is a great place to get past the 7-minute mark. What she finds in her lab is it's at about 7 minutes that people pull out their phones. When we sort of start to feel like, well, I don't know what we're going to say next, we all check our phones. And so find ways to get past the 7-minute mark with your kids, and really good things will happen. You'll ask questions you didn't expect. They'll say things you didn't expect. Sometimes they'll be really hard. Sometimes they'll be really beautiful. Push past the 7-minute mark, because conversation is what makes us human. It's where we find out who we are and who other people are. Mm-hmm. And so go for those more than 7-minute conversations with your kid.
Mm-hmm. Danny, that's great. Are there any resources that you'd like to point people to here if they're thinking, gosh, this is a conversation my family needs to have more about technology or creating or kind of reforming thought and habit in that space? Any resources or things you've just found helpful from yourself or for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, Sherry, if you really want to dig into this, and not everybody needs to, but Sherry Turkle's books, Alone Together and Reclaiming Conversation, are really, really good. She doesn't write from a Christian point of view, I should say, but she does write as a person of serious faith, as a Jewish believer, and as someone who takes kind of the deeper things in the world seriously. And she's such a good observer of the world we're creating and whether we really should want this world we're creating. I did write a book, The TechWise Family, that I wrote it because there wasn't one that I thought was, I wanted it not to be judgmental, but I wanted it to be practical and give you some suggestions. And I wanted it to be something families could read together, especially with older kids. It's called The TechWise Family: Everyday Steps for Putting Technology in its Proper Place. And I did it with Barna Group, and they're a research firm that there's a lot of research in it as well about how we're actually living. And then I wrote the book kind of alongside about how we could live, all of us could live. So I don't know if you want me to recommend my own book, but I wrote it because I didn't have one to recommend. And now I can recommend it, and hopefully someone else will write a better book soon. But for now, TechWise Family is one option.
Yeah, just so you know, by the way, other people we've interviewed on this summit, I think 3 or 4 have recommended your book as one of their resources.
Oh, so encouraging. Wow.
Yeah. Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for joining us, Andy. This has really been great. It's practical, it's good advice, and you got some great stories in here too.
Well, so thrilled we got to talk, and I'm so grateful for parents and kids who take the time to really invest in this. Life will get better. It gets better and harder from here.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you guys so much.